the board and free from the hive mind, this is Rex Bear hosting Leak Project. The Leak Project was created to offer awareness and information not found in the mainstream news. With over 90% of the world's media controlled by only 6 enormous conglomerates, many people today are looking for more accurate information. The Leak Project offers a refreshing approach to the brain drain media. Check back daily for new content as we thrive to bring you the cutting edge in news, current events, on-scene video footage, interviews, and most importantly, the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have returning guest Andrieh Vitimus, modern-day occultist and author of Hands-On Chaos Magic. Andrieh holds the highest ranking in Haitian Voodoo. Also, a Reiki master, NLP practitioner, and licensed hypnotherapist, Mr. Vitimus has a plethora of knowledge on such topics. You can check out Andrieh's work at www.andriehvitimus.com. Also, magicblog.andriehvitimus.com. Like him on Facebook, and his works are available on Amazon. Hey, it's great to have you with us here again at the Leak Project tonight, Andrieh. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing?
Doing wonderful. It's been awesome holidays for us here. San Antonio, the weather has been just crazy. Yesterday it was in the 70s, and today it's been down in the 40s. So this bipolar weather is going pretty crazy right now, having a good time out here. Last time we spoke, you were working on a one-year program, a shape-shifting program, and I just wanted to find out how that was working out for you.
Yeah, I mean, it's going really well. We're on lesson week 15 out of 52, obviously. Unless you live on a different planet than Earth, and there's more weeks in here. But it's going really well. People have already had what I consider really kind of extreme life transformations in good ways. And then we're only 15 weeks in. So we really came out of the gate running, and people were starting to really start heavily analyzing themselves and making the changes that they need, and just really doing what all this is about, which is making a better life for themselves through spiritual work, through energy work, through cognitive remodeling, through all these different techniques put together. And it's really, really humbling to see all the people in the course just kind of having those kind of experiences, which are really, in no uncertain terms, awesome. So awesome, like that you can't even, you see your own work and you see people responding to it, and you see how it's changing people's lives, and it's just awesome. It leaves me speechless.
Now, how long have you been doing it, these programs?
This particular one, this is the first time I'm running it. I ran one that was kind of the precursor to this one for 30 days with 30 exercises it was much shorter and less detailed, less deep in where I was taking people. Usually, I tend to run courses that are more like 6 weeks or so, maybe 1.5 months, and try to see how that goes. I tend to more go the webinar route than the course route, but after this course, I'm trying to shift into it. So, and everyone is extremely happy. So, I've been doing a good job.
Nice. Now, you say it's a one-year course, and are there like exercises and steps that an initiate would take every day, and then at the end of the week you guys get together and find out basically how everything's gone throughout the course of several days?
Yeah, I mean, there's exercises in each week's lessons. Nobody is, I think, up to lesson 15, and that's okay. We help them take it at their own time. We know that, hey, life happens. So if it takes longer than a year, that's okay too. We're gonna keep helping people. But there's only a year worth of lessons, so we know how it is. So there's exercises. You can monitor your progress. People are really, really good about talking to each other on the email group. really kind of helping each other kind of raise each other up. So it's been that's yeah, they can basically see their own progress where they're going, and there's no pressure if they really have a lot going on and they have to take things a little slower.
So let's say somebody signed up for this course and they really wanted to become more aware of their surroundings, and not only physically but spiritually and mentally as well. The ability to open their minds and see things that many people don't. Does this course that you're teaching, does it expand the perceptions of time and space and different spectrums of reality?
Well, we won't take people to the different realities because I would consider that a different course. But the simple answer is absolutely, because once people at first learn their own patterns, their own different ways they interact with the universe, they can then change that. Not only can they change that, they can start sensing when something is outside of normal physical reality, but it's influencing physical reality through information or energy, if you prefer to use the term. I prefer the information. That would be like if spirits were around and they were influencing things or influencing you. So that's all places that people would get to, and then understanding how they can mimic that influence or otherwise transform themselves into these different forces and understand how to gain communication with those forces by actually shape-shifting into forms that are resonant or similar to the forces they want to communicate with or talk to, so they can better understand the information that's coming to them. That takes a little bit more practice than just standard evocation and invocation, but it's somewhat more powerful because people can then directly download lessons from the spiritual world. So while I don't tell people how to get to those other worlds, the spirits that they will be communicating with can take them the extra step of the way once they're in resonance with those spirits.
Yeah, now this sounds fascinating. This is almost like a matrix type setup in the spiritual realms. Maybe we could get into this for a moment, because I remember reading a book by Franz Barden, not the Initiation into Hermetics. It was another one of his, the magical or the practical evocation of magic or something like that. I can't remember off the top of my head, but he talked about different types of spirits that he could literally tap into and download their consciousness or their information, almost like plugging into the matrix. Have you been able to do that before? And if you have, what is it like?
Yes, I certainly have been able to download spirit's consciousness. And in a lot of the part, the shapeshifting class, the end of the shapeshifting class gets to the point that you so eloquently just pointed out, of downloading an alien consciousness into your mind. So what is it like? Well, first, to be honest, it depends on the person. Obviously, it always does. But for most people, when they have an alien consciousness in their mind, what happens is what is considered classical possession at first. Their mind can't deal with it and shuts down. That's what happens with voodoo rites. That's what happens with many African traditional religions. But it can happen when you're doing an invocation of spirit that gets a little out of hand too. Um, you just lose consciousness. And there's a lot of reasons why you lose consciousness. You see, we all have stories. We all have stories that kind of frame our existences. These alien consciousnesses exist outside of those stories. So until the point of which you have conditioned your subconscious mind to handle an alien intelligence, which means that your ego, your conscious mind has really kind of been expanded past the point most people start with. Then you can start melding with the consciousness because you can accept very alternate ideas and beliefs from your own and not freak out. So your mind doesn't have to shut down so that it can all handle the energies inside you. That takes practice. So it's a practice of moving towards from kind of like a possessed state where the entity kind of overlaps you to the point that your conscious mind can deal with the dual consciousness there, and it doesn't kind of have any issues, so that way you can understand what's going on with the spirit. And the way Franz Barton, he doesn't exactly, he explains the end product, but not how you get there.
Do you remember he says in the book, he talks about when you summon up these deities, or you create these sigils and then you usurp them into your mind. It's not them, it's you. It's just a different part of your consciousness, is the way that he describes it. And he says if you think about them of being a separate entity from yourself, then it can make you crazy or psychotic. Is there some merit to that, or what he says do you disagree with in that aspect?
Well, it all depends on perspective, right? Franz Barton is a hermeticist, and I think your listeners have kind of heard what that means, So ultimately, what does he believe? Ultimately, Franz Barton would believe that that his spirit or mind is connected to the all mind. So it's big enough to handle all of these different entities. And he's correct on his assumption that if you really interpret them as a way that they're external entities and try to bring them in, it will take more effort. So there's kind of like semantics going on as to, is it this way or this way? And Barton's much more complicated and it's hard to read. It really kind of is both at the same time, which is a tendency of Hermetic magic. When they talk about mind is all, they're talking about the all mind is all, which is, of course, God, goddess, whatever you believe that term is. And then, of course, you're connected to that all mind. So when they say that it's all just part of your mind, that's true in a way, if you consider it the all mind. It's possible to do that, and it's possible to even assume that they're external entities. But the way you don't become crazy is through practice, through helping your mind go in steps, baby steps towards that, instead of just an all in one. Because even if you assume it's all just part of your mind, that helps minimize the damage, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to stop it. If your consciousness isn't flexible enough to handle the alternative information streams, the alternative alien intelligence, it still can muck about in your subconscious mind and cause problems. Now, you have to remember, by the time you get to the Barton series of books, they're supposed to be done in order, and they're supposed to be worked through. So by the time you get through Initiation to Hermetics, you are supposed to basically have crossed the abyss and more or less have direct communication with your holy guardian angel, or at least the Catholic part of yourself, which is a full-on initiation in a way. So by the time you're pulling these things in your head, you're supposed to have direct communication with your own spirit,
Right.
And then be able to pull it in. So you can't separate out what's in Initiation from Hermetics from his other books, because it was intended that you never try the things in the second book without having gone all the way through Initiation with Hermetics and literally had that contact with your inner godhood. And that's what makes it safe in the second part of it. Now, in the shapeshifting class, I take a bottom-up approach instead of the top-down approach, where I'm having people expand not just expand through information, but through knowledge, through experiential knowledge of what their mind can handle at each step, and then invite alien intelligences after their minds can handle it. Moving towards, of course, if someone chooses, then to have that experience of their own godhood. So it's kind of a bottom-up approach as opposed to the top-down approach that Introduction to Hermetics has.
And I really like how you say with what you're doing with this shape-shifting program that you're actually starting at the end and bringing it backwards. That's quite incredible. So When you do these shape shifting courses, let's say I just sign up. I'm in week one, and I'm just ready to go. I'm excited. I'm looking forward to this new opportunity and initiatory experience. Are you going to tell me, okay, visualize yourself in this other plane as whatever you feel parallels to your energy, or walk us through, if you would please, Andrieh, just walk us through the first step, the first class of
Well,
initiation.
the first class I basically walked through, people, um, the first class was kind of just an introduction, but the first class was just start taking stock of your life. Literally start thinking about what's going on in your life. The second class is even more, and I can give this information away. The second class was even more powerful. Get off social media completely and all internet for a week. Why? Because you're starting to break patterns. Most people, and I think we talked about this in the last show, you cannot consciously start shapeshifting before you become conscious. Most people, unfortunately, because we have so much going on, live in a state of automation. They don't recognize their own patterns. You can't be doing magic to consciously will yourself into different forms if you're automatically just going through every day. So the first step is to break that, to forcefully break the automation. So that way you can consciously choose which aspects of your life you want to have and which aspects of your life you need to let go of. And if you think about the definition of shape changing, that by definition has already changed. Just by doing that act changes the shape of your social reality, your internal reality, and that happens in the first few weeks. And by that point, you already have changed so many aspects of your reality. Your mind is starting to learn to accept change at a fundamental level. So it doesn't get stuck in automation, which means you can always then choose. You can choose what shape reality has around you. You can choose which things you pay attention to. You can choose where your energy is going and how you're using it.
Nice. And you talk about different energies and how you use it and what type of part of your brain you wish to use. When when you do these shape shifting courses, first of all, if you say shape shifting to somebody that doesn't have a clue, somebody that's ignorant, if you say the word shape shifting, they're going to think of, I know, a sci-fi movie or something like that. But what you're referring to is literally changing the essence of your astral or ethereal body, your soul, your astral energy into what you feel will be what you desire.
Eventually, yes, that's where we're going to go with it. Now, my general take on the soul is unique. Um, I don't want to say I have the party line of chaos magicians, but I really mostly think the soul is formless. So the soul kind of exists in a form that already shapeshifts because it's formless. Because, and we can see that if we really get into magic and spirituality, we can see, you know, how are we getting messages from ourselves often changes to the way we need to get messages from ourselves. And the direction we get and the way we seem to communicate with our own essences changes depending on where we're at. And everyone who's been in magic for a while, they kind of see that too. Even the ones that have more dogmatic approaches to there's a holy guardian angel, this is the way it works. The holy guardian angel doesn't always come in the same form. It depends on where you're at. So there's this mutability to the soul because even if you study ceremonial magic and you're hardcore ceremonial magic, you're not taking so much of a shamanic path like I am, Kether can be anything at any time. And that gets I'm sure you've talked about the Tree of Life on the show. I know because you told me you did, right? And Kether is past that which exists and doesn't exist at the same time. So by nature, the nature of the spiritual essence of things is mutable, but it's It's not mutable in the same way things are in the physical world, because it is its own opposite at the same time. This is kind of one of those confusing things that makes, when you study any religion that it takes years to meditate on, that paradox of existing, non-existing, it's its own opposite at the same time, because we don't have the proper language to discuss it. But you're right. When we talk about shapeshifting courses, if there was, everyone would think I was writing the next Underworld movie. Let's talk about the like. Well, you're right. Hey, shapeshifting course. I'll teach you how to become a werewolf. And I kind of talk about that in the course too. Not in the beginning. That there really is actually no anthropological evidence of that happening. Why don't we have any half man, half wolves, right? We should have skeletons. We don't. What we do have a lot of evidence for is not that type of shapeshifting. But we do have lots of evidence to suggest that shamans would cast themselves into what we consider now the astral plane and take possession of animals' bodies. They would push their consciousness into animals. We have lots of stories and lots of evidence from shamanic cultures that this is going on in various cultures across the world. So that's not quite what people nowadays think of as shape-shifting, but it's no less cool and powerful. Although we have to ask, in the modern terms, does this have as much value to master that technique? Maybe not, because we live in a different world.
Well, it's fascinating that you bring up transferring one's consciousness into another animal or entity. I've read about that many times, and I've had my own personal experiences, which I find quite incredible. But let's jump into that for a minute. All energy breaks down to a certain vibrational frequency, and if you really look at the science of this, of magic per se, you can break it down into scientific data. If everything is energy and you can transfer your consciousness to relate to a certain vibrational frequency, therefore you are that entity and you are that consciousness, right?
But does anyone really achieve perfection in that? That's a really good question. And the answer is probably no. The best people can do, until they get really deep, is close resonance, but not quite perfection. Because we're still us. It's still generated through our minds. And the level of skill is determined by how close your mind can emulate that resonance. And to really get too close with any entity or thing probably takes a good degree of training. And you have to remember, if we consider it just resonance, then yes, you can hit that resonance and hit that spirit. But if the spirit has a resonance and an information pattern, even if you hit the resonance, the information pattern might not be exactly correct. So you might not have, even at the right resonance, access to the same information if they are actually external entities. So you can hit the energy, produce some of the same types of miracles, but then you may not have the same personality structure backing that up. So for instance, if I invoke the angel Michael, and I hit the resonance perfectly and everyone's like, yes, the angel Michael is here. Is that the Archangel Michael? Or is this a third thing? Is there me? Is there the Archangel Michael? And then the combination of us two make a third thing, but everyone can recognize that as the Archangel Michael. But in reality, it's something new. It's a third creation that happens from the melding process and the structures in my own mind becoming Michael. At that point, isn't that a type of shape-shifting? I've shape-shifted into something new that is close to the angel, but it's not necessarily exactly the angel Michael, but it's close enough that you can pull all the power and energy. What?
It's like a new entity.
It is, isn't it? I mean, if you really think about how people work with entities, this is something no one ever really wants to admit, especially in books. But each person, but in African traditional religions, and I think in people who really do lots of work with spirits, they act differently for each person because there's a personal third thing that's created is you, the entity, and this interface between the inner entity that you're continuously working with that's limited in time, which most of these entities are not.
It's like a
So,
triad symbolism.
yes, exactly. So there's this new thing where we can talk about how your Michael behaves and how my Michael behaves and compare notes, and it's not going to be exactly the same because this third thing has been created, which is your Michael and my Michael. And even though they're they're
You read my
in,
mind.
yeah, even though it's like a big fractal, they're not exactly the same thing because there's your fractal, there's Michael's fractal, and then there's the third fractal, which might be closer to Michael if you're really good at magic, but it's not exactly Michael because your information is there too.
See, now you're talking about something that's like everything's infinite. Every opportunity that presents itself comes up with infinite opportunities separate from that specific idea. That's incredible. That is absolutely incredible, and that makes me wonder. As far as the different magical archetypes or the different angelic archetypes, I should say, do you feel that these angels, like the archangel Michael and Raphael, etc., are they real, or are they just fragments of one's imagination that puts it into paper that then somebody reads and creates that as a reality?
Well, let's ask another question because the real question gets real contentious, right? Let's ask what is real?
Perception.
Is it? Because our perceptions can lie. Is it real? When we're limited by our perceptions, which is limited by our mind. Can we ever actually know what's real? In most cases, we can only know our perception. And we can't verify whether or not that's real or not because we have no way to get past our perception. Even if we're reading the instruments that we create as people, we are still using our perceptual systems to decide what is real and what is not real. We're still limited by our perceptions, even if we have tools to measure that perception in new and interesting ways. So we get to the question of what is real. We can either say, okay, do we believe this is a Neoplatonic world and these things are absolutely prima facie, they exist? Although I would still argue they do not exist in the way people think, because they exist without time in most cases, and they seem to exist in a different set of reality constraints than we do. Or it's all in your head. Or, even more confusing, is if reality itself reflects the belief you have about reality. Right? So, if you
Wow.
believe these things are absolutely real, guess what? For you and
It's
anytime you do
real.
workings, that's how they manifest. If you believe they're just in your head, guess what? They all manifest like as if you're doing psychology. And believe it or not, this is a premise you can test and try out if you're open-minded enough. And more often than not, you find out reality reflects exactly what you want it to believe. Like that, okay, it's all in your head, then they come to you as all in your head. If you reflect the fact that it's not, they seem to be able to have externalized presences. More than that, it also depends on the strength. There's a lot of factors that depend on like the strength people have of beliefs in either of these
Right.
things in an area. So one person can believe it's all in your head, but if everyone else believes in like a working or kind of a social setting that guess what, it's not all in your head, all of a sudden that person changes their belief because weird things happen that makes them believe it's not all you're in your head. It's not just a construct that someone made. Now that gets really weird, right? Because most people want to have a yes or no answer. Is it in your head or not? And I'm saying, well, maybe it depends on what you think about reality, is how it expresses itself. And that raises a whole bunch of other interesting questions about what's going on in our world around us.
Well, it makes me think of that book by Michael Talbot. He passed away several years ago, but he wrote a book called The Holographic Universe Theory, and he talked about many of these medical experiments that took place where people that had these supposed chronic diseases were given these placebos, and because they believed in it, they were healed.
Well, we first have to understand two things. Really, is science and magic that separate? And it depends on who you talk to. And if we know more about how our brains physically work, why don't we use that in our magic? And this is a question that many of our grimoires come from the 16th century, where we have very little knowledge of the human brain to work with. And yet they were on to they understood lots about the human brains, even if it was encoded in alchemy and other components. They understood the processes of change. But at this point in time, NLP is really kind of an applied cognitive science. It's better just to refer to it as cognitive science in general. We know a lot about how neurons work. We know a lot about how our own patterns are generated in the mind. We know a lot about how the mind processes information. We can use all that to update, to work with these ancient spiritual technologies. Now, mind you, I just gave a huge answer that I probably lean towards thinking these entities as their own spiritual entities. But not always. Sometimes it's more useful not to think of that. But really, if you're going to sit down to pray, isn't it more worthwhile to pray, even if you're a Christian listening to the show, to pray and know Jesus and really see when you pray, see, feel, and know when you pray, shit happens. And the way you get that to happen is to understand how the brain actually works. And how the brain actually works, not only how the brain works, but how you start to clarify your intention when you are trying to talk to or communicate with divine forces. And all that, although it's not spelled out exactly in neurolinguistic programming, and not, it's, of course, that isn't the focus of research in cognitive science, but it certainly is something you can use that for, because it tells you how the structures and mechanisms of the brain work and how you can manipulate those structures towards where you want to go. If you're doing magic, I've often said that if you really get into magic, the first and best thing people can get into is psychology. Because even in Hermetic and ceremonial magic, the axiom is know thyself. To really understand yourself, your motivations, how your mind actually works, will give you an infinite amount of steps forward when you start actually summoning things or start trying to move the forces of reality around, because you'll understand this is how my mind works. This is how my mind works when I start making changes. So it's not too much of a stretch then to understand this is how my mind works. This is how it works when I make changes. This is what I actually want, which is actually probably the thing that most people, they're never sure of.
That makes me think about that saying of Aleister Crowley, where he says, "Do what thou wilt is the whole of the law. Love is the law. Love under will." And then therefore you can do better in your manifestation of reality because you know what you are.
Well, yeah. And we have much better psychology and neurology than even Mr. Crowley had. And so there's no reason not to use that as a starting point. And I think that's one of the ideas that hasn't become popular about in magical circles, um, but it should. Why do we have to separate these tools? All the tools there can elevate people, and if they are useful to elevate you, to get you where you want to go, to build the life of an upward spiral with other people, and really, that's the most important thing. What definition or label we put on the tools, whether it's NLP, cognitive science, magic, occultism, is less relevant.
Also, I had the opportunity to watch a movie. I was probably about a year, maybe a year and a half ago. It was called Branded. And I don't know if you've seen this movie or not, Andrea, but in the movie, it basically has, the design of the movie is what controls people behind the scenes, and there's these entities that literally latch onto people and control them in basically an ethereal realm. And I'm wondering, as if to the information and knowledge that you have, do you think that there's entities behind the scenes, like these parasitic ethereal parasites, whatever you want to call them, that latch on to people to create certain energies, or to feed off of their energies and create certain scenarios?
Well, first, in my experience, and I can only talk about my experience, does those kind of entities exist? Absolutely. You know, of course, yes. How common are they? It depends on what we define as entity. And but those entities, and certainly even external entities of that sort, exist, and they do cause problems. But then it depends on how we look at it too, because shamans of old used to say that anyone with a mental illness had these kind of entities attached to them, and in some cases,
Is there
their
truth to that?
techniques did work. What?
So I didn't mean to interrupt, Andrea, but it seems like some of these people that have schizophrenia, that hear voices and stuff like that, I've wondered for years, are there things out there that are really saying that to them, or is it just in their head?
Well, we have to assume that it could be both. And let's not discount the medical science. Let's not we know schizophrenia is kind of a brain imbalance. It's also one of the least understood diseases that we still don't really understand. We understand enough to understand sort of what happens in severe schizophrenia, but people really don't understand what happens in mild schizophrenia. They really have some theories, but they don't know. And it can be anything from brain chemistry issues to a traumatic event to various other things. Now, what if? What if we don't look at an yes or no answer? We say, if you look at this from a shamanic point of view, they would say that that person has spiritual sickness. If you look at that from a medical point of view, you would see that they clearly have some brain abnormalities. Why do those two things have to be in opposition? Because they can, in fact, be both at the same time. This is a dichotomy that happens again and again and again with religion versus science. It doesn't have to conflict. The two things can exist simultaneously, as if we were looking at the same thing from a different angle with different starting assumptions. Did you ever see the comic book, or it was like a drawing of blind people with an elephant?
I don't think so.
And they're reaching out to the elephant. Yeah, there's three blind men, all have to describe an elephant, but they're blindfolded, so they can only do it through touch. And they grab a piece of the elephant and they say, "Well, this is what this is." And they have no idea what the whole is. What if our reality works much more like this, where science has, is looking at it from one angle but can't see other angles, and occultism is looking at it something being, it can't see the other angles, and a third different religion would see it in a different way and can't see all the angles. Except when you put them all together, you realize everyone was wrong because it was an elephant, and they had no idea it was an elephant because they were blindfolded. And a lot of our perceptions are put into things that look like blindfolds. And I talk about this in the shape-shifting course rather extensively. We all have blindfolds. We can't live without blindfolds. Because if we can hold on to too many perceptions at the same time, too many different ways to look at the world at the same time, it just is madness. It would be like what we talked about earlier. You're pulling in artificial intelligences that have a very different mindset. With Barden, what happens? Madness. So we have stories. We have a unified story. This is the way reality works for us. And we have to constrain ourselves to fit within that, even though opposite things could possibly exist at the same time. And probably when we get to the point in science that they accept this is the point we'll start making real quantum leaps all of a sudden in the very near future.
In our last interview, we had the opportunity to talk about these energies or these forms of energies that were created, like a corporation, for example, like a Fortune 100 company that has all sorts of power and money and energy creates, what did you call that energy, Andrieh?
Yeah, energy and tension can create those type of entities.
Well, you called it. You had a specific name for it, an egregore.
Egregores?
Egregore. So you've got these egregores that are created, these energies that are created, and do they fight amongst each other? Are they like?
Well, you have to think about. The simple answer is yes, because that's what corporations do. You have to think about this, and this goes right to the heart of the comment I just made, is just because a corporation has a spiritual presence, which is probably in most cases of the corporation not very nice, this does not necessarily mean they don't physically do things in the world. We know that because we know corporations do in fact do many things in the world. They have people working for them. They're not actually physical entities. They are fictional entities in the legal sense of the word. They don't physically exist, although they might have physical assets. And they move through the world, changing things. Now, when we look at it from a spiritual point of view, we have to realize the character of that spiritual entity is going to reflect the culture of the physical thing. So whether or not that exists or not, or whether or not it's just a personification, you can certainly get lots of information and understanding from that kind of interaction. We know that corporations are fighting all the time. It's in the corporate structure to essentially go for dominance in capitalist societies. So if that's built into their DNA, as it were, they're going to follow that programming. And we can see that they do. And we can see they do that often in ways that are counterproductive to the long-term survival, that they'll compete so much in the short term that the long-term survivability goes down, and possibly in the long term, what they do to our environment and other places because of this competition is even less likely to hold on to their survival. And that's what happens when you're focused on short-term conflicts, have to get higher profits than the next company. And if we take all that information and see how they're acting, yeah, it is like two guys slugging it out in a bar trying to have dominance, when in reality, in most of these cases, if people understood economics and how things work in our economic system, probably most of the time both companies could survive and be quite profitable with slightly different niches. But there's this impulse to take all that you can. That's built into the capitalist system and built into the corporate legal structure that forms the DNA of the corporation itself, which is what you would build the spiritual egregore or try to communicate the spiritual egregore with, is all built on those frameworks.
Feel that the earth has some type of life essence or some type of spirit per se that creates a humble environment. Do you think that the earth is real, like as far as a life form, or do you think it's just a rock with a bunch of life on it that people are going to continue to feed off of until there's nothing left?
Well, first we have to. That's a complicated question because we first know there's whole theories in science. We could multiple systems obviously have a goddess of Mother Earth, but there's multiple systems in science that talk about the Gaia theory, and the Gaia theory is more or less what you just said: is that the Earth should be treated as a whole living organism, and in a lot of ways our ecosystems are not separate from each other, right? I can't just cross the Canadian border and boom, if I'm in Michigan, what I do in Michigan doesn't have any effect in Canada. No. These things can cascade through the whole environment down the line. So it's clear that we are in a system, and it's a complex system that looks like a living being, and that means that we cannot really just separate it out or think what one person does in one country over here, if it's really bad, doesn't have an effect on us. That's just short-sighted thinking in anybody's estimation. Now, whether or not it's just a rock, well, that is, depending on which belief system you have, a tenet of some forms of Christianity and some
What's your
forms of
belief system?
Islam. What if everything on Earth had a spiritual presence?
Right.
A rock, the trees, grass? What if even if our dwellings had a spiritual presence? Our houses? You know that cities resemble ant farms when you turn an ant farm upside down.
Right.
So it's not like we're even that particularly unique in the structure we've built for ourselves. It's been done before in nature. But what if all of that had different spiritual forces, even ones that we built, with thought forms and everything, and the whole system was alive? That's closer to what I would like to believe. Now, granted, I'm not bound by the demon of consistency. I could change my belief if needed. That's supposed to be a little humor to insert there.
So,
disclaimer. So,
no, I appreciate that because it seems as if, everything's moving at protons, neutrons, electrons, atoms, bacteria, everything. There's some type of movement. Let's jump to the next possibility here. Speaking with the dead, the physical dead, ancestral communication, summoning spirits. How would one do that? Have you ever communicated with somebody like an ancestor that you lost or that passed away previously?
sure. And this is where, as a voodooist, we do that all the time. And sometimes the communication is really good. Sometimes not so much. And you have to realize that for most people, at first it's going to start out, it's kind of difficult because the chatter of the mind makes it difficult. We have to then ask, well, has there been any occurrences that I got information that I could not possibly have had? The answer is yes. There's no way I could have possibly had the information that I received. So those communications had to be valid. So I have some evidence to suggest it. Okay. And when I work with clients, I often get information there's no way I could have. Which again suggests that you can communicate with these forces. So now how is a different question. First, how depends on which system you're working with. Obviously, some systems of magic are not very dead friendly, so you can't work it as easily from systems that outright forbid working with the dead. have to realize that's a difficulty, especially with Christianity, which most brands, not all, most do forbid working with the dead. Because it's tricky.
What?
But for those that want to work with the dead, what I found, go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Andrieh, but I want to ask, because this is really important. You've got so many religions out there that have so much control over the world right now, and anything that is outside of their spectrum they call, satanic or anti-Christian. Why?
Well, why do you think? I mean, it's us
I think
versus
it's
them,
for control.
Right? It is for control. Us versus them is a formula of population control since the dawn of man probably itself. Simply define somebody as not in your group, then you define people who are in your group, and that gives you a better control because there's always a threat that you'll remove them from the people who are in your group. That means an uplifting of your friends, your family. It means you could lose a lot, actually. And humans are biologically hard-coded. We actually cover this in the shape-shifting too. Humans are hard-coded to want to form groups and want to be in groups. So the threat of being expelled from a group is very, very painful for most people. And it's a very good control mechanism, unfortunately. And that's why you do it.
Okay.
So you hit the nail right on the head. So how would you communicate with the dead? I have my own particular way. And I talked about this a little, when I had my podcast. But essentially, the first and most important thing is, if you're going to try to communicate with the dead, you want to do so in love and not necessarily remember the bad times or that they died. That's not, if you assume that a dead entity exists and it's not just a shade of your mind, do you think they want to talk about how they died?
No.
Of course not. They want to talk to you about the vacation you had with them, the good times. And if you put out a white glass with a white candle and cover it with a white sheet and just meditate on your ancestor, and it should be an ancestor you start with. You should not start with a random external dead. Somebody you had life experience with that you love them and they love you. And you just really think about with all five of your senses, that dead person and the good times you had. I mean, go back to the memories. In most cases, if you're really quieting the mind down and doing this, you'll feel some presence. And if you do it enough times in a few weeks or so, you'll start getting weird confirmations that you are in fact communicating with something that, well, it may or may not be in your head, but it seems like it's not. Because you're either getting information that you couldn't possibly have, or your ancestor will tell you, I'm going to try to work on this for you, and then shit just works out right. And it gets too many coincidences to ignore.
So where do they go? Like, what happens after this physical?
So the question of the afterlife really depends. And I have had a lot of experience. Now in Voodoo, there's different metaphors for what's going on. And in my experience, it seems like different things happen depending on the strength and kind of personality structures. Like some cases, what you would consider the essence of a person or the makeup of a person can split. So their body splits from their personality, which splits from their essence, and then their higher essence, and those go to different places. Like the body goes back into Mother Earth, gets recycled. Well, it used to. Now it gets put into a casket that never can break for 10,000 years here, but that's a different story.
Is there a conspiracy behind that?
Well, I don't know if there's a conspiracy. It's just our customs.
Right, like our customs. Like
more
you can't go back into Earth. You have to stay in this physical box for millions of years.
Well, you know what it is it's not a conspiracy. It's that our culture is profoundly afraid of death.
That's
right?
What it is.
If you think about it, why do you
that
put
makes sense.
Gravestone? And a marker like that is that we are truly horrified by death. And that's why you put somebody in a casket where they won't rot, even though everything decays and rots, because you're horrified by death. So you want their remains to stay separate from the earth.
Was that
That's
the
just
Egyptians were doing? Like, they would basically mummify these bodies to last for thousands of years because they feared of death
only
as
the
well?
kings, though. It's only the kings, and that had to do with they certainly were not afraid of death, but that had to do with the fact that they literally believed that the kings were the physical embodiment of godhood or the gods in some cases. So
Wow.
they would try to preserve that to give the gods a physical talisman to remain on Earth throughout time.
That makes
Yeah,
sense.
it gets complicated, but our culture hates death. It despises death. So instead, it tries to separate out the evil and the remains into something that's sealed. You know what I'm saying? And well, that we can go into the environmental costs of that, and you know. But that being said, some other people, I think, in my experience, gain enough strength or break the automation enough or gain enough spiritual essence to take much of their personality with them. And that would be at a higher level of operational magic. And at that point, they would have to make some real hard decisions at even post death on what they were going to do because they cannot exist in that state forever. That's not exactly what a ghost is. They'll have to either find new life or do something else, you know.
Like
And
like a ghost. Let's talk about that for a second if we can. I told you earlier in the podcast that my mom, she worked at an emergency room in a hospital, and not only did she see a full apparition of a ghost, but one of her coworkers did as well. What is a ghost? If somebody sees a full apparition of somebody that died 5 minutes ago or 5 hours ago, what is that?
well, it depends on what is actually going on at the time, right? So the thing you're talking about, the apparition, the person just died. It could actually have been the soul of a person just reaching out, confused, not thinking they were dead, and making their presence known until they realize they were dead and they move on. In other cases, the ghost is the fragment of the personality without the actual soul that remains, and it kind of goes and kind of feeds on the living or feeds on the emotional energies around. In other cases, it's not even what you would consider an intelligence at all. It's like a memory being played over and over and over, especially in traumatic things like poltergeist and stuff. So it's just like a DVD player skipping because the event is so traumatic that it gets kind of embedded in that area, and they just repeat over and over and over. Um, in other cases, it's fragments of of the dead's personality that cause problems because some parts of the personality go, and other parts stay behind and kind of try to feed because they try to sustain themselves in any way they can
So,
without the whole
are,
consciousness of the whole.
are they separate forms? Are they separate energy slash life forms?
Well, at that point, they kind of are, unless you have a shaman or a priest who can go grab all the parts, even if they're in different parts, to kind of unify the being. And this actually happens more than people would think. That there's a part that's trying to remain. You know, in some cases, the actual fear of death is so profound that it empowers them to carry on and be a ghost with most of what they had in life. Ghosts tend to change. Those type of ghosts tend to change much slower than we can in the real world, in the living world. So there's all different kinds of different ghosts depending what situation you're in. You kind of have to then decide, well, what am I dealing with? And that's actually why, if it's an angry or a really negative spirit, you don't really want to deal with it. That's why I said deal with your ancestors if you want to communicate with the dead, not with some random spirit that you don't know what's going on with them. Because you can't always assume that it's a good person, right? If they weren't a good person in life, even if they're fragments of a very bestial personality, you don't want to necessarily deal with that. And that's isn't our society doesn't always support those who are the just, right? So, you know, if a corrupt CEO dies and part of his personality splinters off and remains, is that something you want to really deal with? I'm not so sure. So
Right.
you have to kind of be careful about that. But all those different possibilities could happen, and I've had experiences with each of those, and each of those scenarios requires a different way to deal with the issue or invite or to work with that particular dead.
Well, let's say for example that somebody wants to summon Steve Jobs because they want to tap into his energy and his life force, but let's say that Steve
Well,
reincarnated. Could they still like if people reincarnate, how do they tap into somebody's life force or somebody's essence in the astral realm if they've been reincarnated into
right.
life again?
And I have to remember initially what I was saying is that, as Voodoo Sans, who think that different parts of the souls go in different ways. Well, if they're really communicating with Steve Jobs, at this point, they're probably pulling the personality. Now, to be honest, most people, when they summon Steve Jobs at this point, all they're summoning is a thought form of Steve Jobs because they don't have personal connections with Steve Jobs. They've never met him. They don't know what his real personality is. All they know is what they saw on television. So they have an artificial creation, a thought form that they're pulling forward that isn't necessarily Steve Jobs. It would be very difficult unless you had deep, intimate connection with Steve Jobs to know the difference between those two things. But you can rest assured that there is a difference because he was used to working in the public eye, and there's this whole egregoric force of Steve Jobs still out there, a Steve Jobs way of doing things. So you could summon Steve Jobs, and you'd get this egregore. That might be very helpful, actually, in trying to get that do exactly what you said. But is that the real Steve Jobs? Probably not. Because why would Steve Jobs, if he exists in afterlife, come to some stranger he never met in life?
You believe in reincarnation, right, Andrea? Or do
For
you?
some people.
So what happens to
I
the
don't
other people
think
and
everyone does.
okay, so for somebody that isn't able to be reincarnated, why would that be and where would they go?
I think that people generally, depending on what they do in life, they either take the information with them and then possibly reincarnate, but not necessarily on the same planet or time or any or even reality that we're in now, or they kind of dissolve back in this only their spark. Now, I don't really. I have to paraphrase. This is not to kind of make anyone feel on the spot or anything. I think most people start with a spark. That is the best metaphor, I think, for the soul. It's a spark. This is something that Gurdjieff pushed a whole bunch, and other spiritual leaders kind of is that we start with a spark. And that essence we can do something with or not. If we don't do anything with it, it's kind of like the personality dissolves and the spark goes back to all that is chaos, the void, the Tao, whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter. We all have different names. But should someone reach out and become truly strong in their personality, we have probably the ability to not dissolve. And maybe in some cases, that's what the great work is about. I don't think that's the only thing the great work of magic is about. But I think it's not just elevation, but if your imprint is so strong on that spark, perhaps you don't have to dissolve.
Let's look at the possibility of there being different life forms out there, different planets, different worlds, etc. And, some people talk about the Greys, the Reptilians, the Dracos, the Mantids, whatever. But, if the universe really is, let's look at the Omniverse, if it is so gigantic that, mathematically speaking, there has to be other life forms like ourselves out there based upon the stimuli or the mathematical equation. Would you say that these different life forms out there, you talked earlier about alien life forms, do you feel that there's other energies or other people like ourselves that are out there within the universe physically, just at a specific point, like a different planet, etc., that have the same spirit essence that we do, and they're a part of the same platform?
Well, they could be part of the same platform, but they certainly can't have the same essence as us because they're not the same things as us. That doesn't mean that if the spark is relatively formless, it doesn't mean that one cannot transfer. And certainly, people believe that they are a reincarnation of an alien intelligence or other things like that. So that's all possible. Now, whether or not that is what's going on, we can't say. But it's certainly, if you think about it, and this is purely my opinion because I haven't died yet.
Well,
the spark,
in this life.
Well, yes, in this life. So, and I haven't died yet, so I don't have. What we have to think about it is why couldn't you go to a different world and totally have a different form if the spark was formless? And what does that mean? The one thing is that we never talk about when I go on the shows is, what if the reality is just a simulation to start with? And we're in this Gnostic paradise, or prison, as it were. Well, at that point, it makes perfect sense that you would go from one form to another, and the spark would just carry through, and then you would get put into a different body across the universe and a whole different simulation. In the end, it makes sense that, to me, in a practical way, if you have a strong enough input, a strong enough imprint on that spark, that you could grow that spark. Not just keep it where it's at. You could grow that spark and that you wouldn't dissolve. But that takes a lifetime of work. That's why people study magic their whole life to kind of make this progress.
Right. And Andrieh, you talk about dissolving. So what does that mean?
Well, you would probably come back with something as something else. And you probably wouldn't even have what is classically thought of as of past life, or they might just be not clear, because the dissolving process would wipe those memories away because they didn't imprint the spark enough to matter, if that makes sense.
You're very knowledgeable in hermetics, the occult, magic, Haitian voodoo, all sorts of other type of magical practices. What do you feel is going to happen to you, Andrieh, when you pass from this physical realm?
Well, I think and I hope that I have enough imprinting on my spark that I won't dissolve. And from there, I have other realities that I would like to explore.
I mean, do you feel that the universe is your oyster, basically, and you can do whatever you want to after you physically leave this planet?
I don't know that you can do whatever you wanted to. Obviously, there's other spirits in the universe. But ultimately, the spark is, in fact, made of spiritual nature. We can discuss whether or not there is a spark or not, whether it's formless or not. We can discuss all that stuff. But if we're going to accept that there is such a thing as a spark, well, that means that you are partially spirit. And that means if it's imprinted, you still have to deal with other spirits. But that doesn't mean that you can't create your own reality at that point and invite other things to join you. Why not?
Do you believe in heaven and hell?
Not in the way that is traditionally thought of, but those are certainly places because people have created them. And just because the people have created them doesn't mean they're not real. And it doesn't mean that they're not real for many of the people and souls that so firmly and confidently believe they're going to heaven or hell. Or one metaphor for this is, what dreams may come. God rest Robin Williams. What do people get? Maybe it works in a very similar way to reality, except it's more flexible. You get whatever you believe you're going to get. Now, are there places, we have to paraphrase that a little, right? Are there places that certainly seem like they have chthonic, infernal energies in the astral plane? Absolutely. Is there places that seem like they have angelic, or what we classically call angelic energies on the astral plane in my experience? Absolutely. Are those heavens or hells? Well, now we get into some semantic arguing about what's what, don't we?
So, what are your thoughts on Jesus?
He's a great guy. I wish his followers would follow his message. Let's take another approach, because it goes back to the idea of just because somebody may have created this doesn't mean it's not real now. And that takes a different way of looking at things. So, right now, billions of people on Earth believe that there's an entity of Jesus Christ. By that fact alone, there exists an entity of Jesus Christ. What we would only be able to argue about was what was the cause of this entity. The reality of Jesus Christ is there because it's in the imagination of billions of people. It exists. You can summon it. You can talk to Jesus, and you can work magic with Jesus. And there's people who do tons of successful healing in Jesus' name. This is not really even open to negotiation. It's provable. We can prove this all happens. Now the question becomes, how did that entity start, is a totally different question from its reality. Ultimately, at this point in time, it doesn't matter how it started, because so many people believe in that entity and have gotten so much benefit. Well, some people have gotten so much benefit from that entity. We get into the historical accounts. Yeah, you could say, the strict historical scientist or historian will say, maybe Jesus doesn't exist. But the evidence isn't conclusive there either. It's kind of like people argue about it all the time. But from a spiritual point of view, we know Jesus exists because we know in the hearts and minds of billions of people Jesus exists. If we can talk about corporations having an egregore, we certainly know that there is a Jesus that exists. Now, I don't necessarily think that everyone who prays to Jesus per se is praying to the same thing, because those Jesuses don't look the same at all to me when you hear people talk. They seem like completely different Jesuses.
Well, do you think that, most people that pray to Jesus and are Christian, do you feel that they're actually praying to an entity that was born and portrayed the events that was described in the Holy Bible?
Don't know. I mean, certainly I've had my own spiritual experiences with Jesus, but I never asked about the history because it's not important of a question to me. I don't consider myself Christian per se, but we also have to take into account the history of the Bible is very conflicted. And most Christians don't even understand that the Paul account of the Bible doesn't occur till 200 years after Christ. And
Right.
that happens from a Roman tax collector, arguably for the reasons of social control. So it puts a very different spin on the Bible if you leave everything from Paul out and you read the other three Gospels. They're much more congruent about what Jesus actually says. Um, and the message is more clear. So it gets complicated. What is going on here? You know, and I don't want to get into a fight with people about that because I'm a practical magician, not a religious scholar per se. Other religious scholars could argue the historicity of whether these events happened. What I think is important is if you believe you're a Christian, first, I would, from my extensive experience with the Bible, I would say leave what Paul says out of it. And second, have you really read what's in there?
Right.
If you really believe that this is the way to live your life, do you know how to pray? So that way you get the results you want from what you're going for. Are you living in a way that really focuses on the values of love and charity? You know, and all the things that Jesus actually talked about. Well, those are the questions that people should be asking, and those are questions worth them asking. And they're worth this 2 days after Christmas. They should especially be asking those type of questions. And then ask what kind of world do they want. I think that's important. It, if you really believe it, it's okay to really believe that, and it doesn't. No one's. It doesn't matter if it's real or not. But what really matters, are you living up to what you say you believe? And if you're not, well, consider your beliefs. And I know it's difficult. But that's the most important thing. And realize there is, in fact, like I said, a spiritual egregore named Jesus, or Jesus, or not Jesus, but, or Yeshua, what actually is the
Right.
proper name.
Right.
And does this philosophy of Christianity help you embrace life and really help you grow as a person and really help you develop better relationships with the people around you and really get you on this upward spiral where every day has more meaning for you? If the answer is yes, then any arguments we can have about whether the events of the Bible happened or not is irrelevant. If the answer is no, then take this opportunity to take the courage to reject it because it's not helping you.
When you look at the different realities that are presented within themselves, you talk a lot about the different sides of people. You've got the specific side where people want to show everybody how they feel and think and etc. But then you've got the shadow side, the shadow self, initiation, etc. How do you explain the shadow side of somebody?
Is that what you don't want to admit? And we all have that. That which is in darkness, it isn't darkness per se. It isn't what people classically think as evil. It's just we don't want to admit it. And we don't want to see it. So people will often, especially if they have had trauma, a person who's bullied will often sometimes show tendencies to bully someone because they learned that and it's their subconscious mind striking back out. But they don't want to admit that about themselves. So those tendencies form blind spots. Really, really big blind spots. Where if your mom, let's say, couldn't stabilize relationships, and you learn that lesson, then you can't stabilize relationships. You don't even see that this is a pattern that started with your mom and that it's carrying to you. And the thought never crosses your mind. It forms another blind spot. It's hidden from you. You know, all the pain and suffering that we often go through all goes in the shadow. So it's hidden from us. So we don't have to access it on a daily basis. But it all affects our behavior. It all affects our journey through life. And in classical alchemy, a lot of the stuff that's in the shadow is the lead that needs to be transmutated into gold. It is the pain, the suffering, all the stuff we don't want to admit about ourselves, and the reasons and motivations that don't fit into polite company for why we do things that need to be brought up into the light of consciousness of what you know about yourself. This goes back to the notion that most people, not everyone, but of course most people have a lot of automation going on in their life. That a lot of things are automated, so they might not stop and reflect on their own pain. It's uncomfortable. The subconscious mind will throw that into the dark corner and ignore it, and it kind of festers. And we know that because we can see what happens when a trauma festers and it's not dealt with. Is eventually it manifests in different psychoses or personality problems or adaptations that are not quite optimal. That's all shadow stuff. It's all the stuff we don't want to admit. It's all the stuff that we don't want to deal with. Subconscious mind just hides it from us. And when we wonder why in our own lives we're not successful, or there's things that just don't seem to work out, oftentimes it's because there's stuff hidden in the shadow from our subconscious mind to protect us from feeling the pain of those things. And those things have to be examined. They have to be sought out. They have to be distilled in meditation. Really, really, what we're talking about, a lot of hard work. But a lot of really worthwhile work. Well, some of the most rewarding work to get the catharsis and healing that you would otherwise ignore.
Do you feel, or do you think that there's different entities out there or different races out there that can control the human consciousness similar to somebody controlling a dog?
Why not? People can do it to people all the time.
Do you believe
we know that? We know that. So if we know that people can do it, why shouldn't entities be able to do the same thing? And we know that in most cases, they can. Even if we get down to the idea of an entity as an idea, ideas control people all the time.
Right.
They most certainly do. You know, even if they're not external entities, we certainly see ideas that are controlling large swaths of our society. There's no doubt that an idea is forming control mechanisms around people that go all in on some of these ideas. It changes every part of their life. And even if we don't think of anything other than an entity as a resonance or an idea, it's still, we can completely see that it does have a lot of control. Ideas, entities, we can call them what you want, but they have tons of control, especially when people embrace those things, even if they don't know what they're embracing.
Well, and there was a book that was called The Lesser Keys of Solomon, and it describes 72 entities that you can summon up via sigils and different ceremonies, and it describes them as these entities that have amazing powers, but they're very dark and lower and esoteric, etc. So do you think that these energies are available for anybody and that they can summon them and harness them, but they have to give us something back for using their energies?
I think it's a really good idea to give something back if you're going to use those energies. Um, Classical ceremonial magic, of course, maybe you don't have to. But I've always seen it better if you give something back for using their energies. And it also depends. Again, we get to this idea, is it all in my head? I didn't conceive it as such, and I got results that were not in such a way that did not appear to be all in my head. And should people work with those entities? That depends on your point of view. They're not as one question we should ask is how much do we trust the Catholic Church at that point, because most of those grimoires come from the Catholic Church. So it's a real question of, do we really trust that these things are evil per se?
The Lesser Keys of Solomon came from the Catholic Church?
That one might not have come from the Catholic Church but it's certainly not. It does not necessarily trace back to Judaic culture, so we're not sure where it comes from. But we know that the people who originally were doing that were Christian magicians.
Okay.
And even the old Dr. Rudd books, which are some of the older copies of the Goetia we have much more Christian symbols than say Lon Mile and Aleister Crowley's
Sure.
books on the Goetia. And Aleister Crowley hated Christianity, so we can see he possibly moved it to more Judaic symbols. But the original ones have more Christian language in them. Other books we know are from the Catholic Church, from the grimoires. They're directly from the Catholic Church. And oftentimes we don't know whether or not, we cannot really be sure of whether or not some of these books, how much they were tampered with by the church. Well, what are the policies, the political policies of the entity known as the church, which are totally different than Catholics practicing? Right? So that's an entirely different conversation. Now, certainly, you could take offense to some of the organizational ideas that the Catholic Church maintains. You could take offense to some of the things they do. Do you say that's all of Catholicism is just what some priests or bishops do, or are we talking about a different religion for some people who actually are maybe Catholic out in Europe and they're just praying? I think we really need to make a distinction between those things and not really blame one person who's a Catholic for what is an organizational failing or a larger organizational failing. I think dehumanizing people as saying, "Oh, is there an evil force?" dehumanizes their personal beliefs, and there probably isn't that evil force taking over their particular practice. So I think it's really important to think about it in a way that, what is the person I'm dealing with? How do they work with these systems? How do they work with the beliefs? How do they live up to the beliefs they're espousing? I think that's more important from an individual point of view than looking at the political organization, which is inherently flawed and should be criticized, if that makes sense.
So, do you believe in good and bad, or do you think it all just is?
I do not believe in good and bad, because everything has a place. Most of the time, what one person says is good, another person says is bad. It depends on the situation. I could eat tons of chocolate. People love chocolate. It's not quite so good for me if I have diabetes. Likewise, people love the internet. They love Facebook, but it's not so good if you spend all your time on there. There's other spirits where you could work angelic work all the time, but it's not so good if your life becomes completely imbalanced. So it depends on where you're at and what you need and what's going on in your life. uh, as to what's good and evil. And good and evil, again, it usually is a political distinction. It's not a, a trait. It's not a description of a trait. It says more about the person who's defining something as good or evil is a statement about the person making the statement as to what's good or evil. It says something about them more than it says anything about the universe. It isn't at all clear. It depends a lot on the person at that point. And this is why I don't believe in necessarily good and evil. Even somebody who is doing drugs, I know that's the big evil, right? Well, study after study has clearly shown why people do drugs is because the environment that they're in most cases, creates a system where they feel completely disempowered from any kind of control over their lives. Rat studies have consistently shown that if you bring rats out of a congested area of rats, such as a city of rats per se, and put them in where they have more activities, where they can expand their mind, they will stop seeking out morphine on their own because they're self-medicating. Because the stresses of the world around them causes them so much internal pain that when they put too many people together, too cramped, there's no room for them to explore or have their minds activated. Changes. There's every reason, and a lot of supporting evidence suggests people are exactly the same. Why do people do drugs? Well, if you have no hope because there's a reality that presents itself where you're in poverty, you can't get out of poverty, you can see all the commercials of iPhones everywhere, well, doing drugs numbs the pain. It makes it so you can deal with a reality that is entirely harsh. Of course, we can say that we deal with that reality through meditation and take a holier than thou attitude towards these people, but the same thing, we are just calming our minds and getting rid of the pain in a different way. And certainly, I think most of the people, if you could spend some time with them and really hear them and listen to them and treat them as a human being, they would, and teach them even some basic techniques of meditation, they would wean themselves off of the drugs. Why? Because they can get some sense of their own destiny, of their own control, and they'll take it. So it's not quite so easy to define good or evil outside of the system and outside of the series of systems that we all live in. It's a political choice. I could call those people evil, which I wouldn't, and I clearly outlined my belief on that. But I could call other things evil or good. And that indicates more choices on what I'm prioritizing in the world than the world itself. People will disagree with me, and people will hold to their beliefs very strongly. But ultimately, all it has to say about is what I believe is the most important things. And those things I call good.
You talked about, I know we're getting close to the end of the hour here, but you said previously that you had the opportunity to be a part of the Church of Set, and there's a lot of information out there on the web that is inaccurate. I was hoping you could maybe just explain a little bit what the Church of Set is, and who is Set.
Well, the Temple of Set is an organization, a left-hand path organization that really believes in academic and intellectual force of will. It's very similar to some other left-hand path information. And they kind of focus on the entity named Set as this kind of primordial spark that allows human evolution. Much like Prometheus, they call that Set, the bringer of chaos, the one who achieved his own immortality in some stories. And different people who are in the Temple of Set have very different beliefs about what set is, other than they will acknowledge there is a presence of darkness, and they don't mean evil. Uh, it's much more like closer to the black box in 2001: A Space Odyssey. It's a black force of self-evolution, and that's very different from the notion most people have of, evil.
Could you explain that a little bit?
Well, say the reason that the Temple of Set and many of these left-hand paths organizations are placed in opposition to Christianity or other religions is because they teach you to develop more or less with different styles your own internal strength versus compliance. There's no notion in some of the Abrahamic religions of your own internal strength outside of God. It just isn't there because the whole point is to serve God. The left-hand path is originally derived, the words are originally derived from Hinduism, which means a totally different thing about what left-hand path is, but it's still the path of transgression, which means it's the path of destroying and avoiding social constraints so you're more free to express your own divinity. In many cases, that's what even the Temple of Set and the left-hand path organizations do. So you're building yourself up. Some are not even what would be considered spiritual. The Temple of Set is. They believe there is this spiritual force of evolution. And that self-evolution means becoming more and more ascendant into your own personal power, or they would call it godhood. And it is different from what I described about imprinting the spark, but it's in the same ballpark at least. And that you can grow in personal strength and competency through your life through the use of spiritual forces to develop yourself in new ways. That's very different because it involves intellectual acumen, and not only intellectual acumen, much self-reflection, brutal honesty about where you're at in life. So you can't just pass it off and say, hey, God did this to me, or it's not God's will. You just have to admit in those philosophies that you weren't good enough and you have to try harder. And you have to go out. It's not necessarily, the Temple Set clearly believes in an entity named Set that is that force of evolution. And you have to go out. If you're not at a place where you're achieving your goals, you have to use and work with that force in a meaningful way to change yourself so you can.
So, if you look at the Church of Set or the Temple of Set, and it's based upon this belief of worshiping this entity that presented itself several
I wouldn't
thousand
say
years
it's
ago.
worship so much as it is acknowledging that there is a force and then working with it. Worship, they
What
may
is
not
worship?
accept so much.
What is worship, Andrieh?
Well, isn't worship is different than connection, right? Worship is you are putting yourself on a pedestal much lower than what you are seeking to supplicate, or not supplicate. You are supplicating yourself to something greater. Connection implies that you may be, in fact, respectful, but raising up to the level of that, even if it's a process that you can't achieve. It's a different mentality of how you work with entities.
Is Lucifer considered, in your opinion, a entity that can be?
So this is another entity that is difficult, right? Because what do people mean when they say Lucifer? A Christian generally means Satan, but they're not the same. And even, in fact, the name Lucifer appears only once in the Bible, and it seems to be generally conceded that it was a misprint or a um, name, because Lucifer literally means the morning star, which is an aspect of Venus. And I think we talked about that more in the last show. And it's literally light. And if you go back to other sources, that could mean enlightenment in a way as well. So, which Lucifer are we talking about? It's like Jesus. Which Jesus are people applying? Now, in my personal experience, you know, this entity has a unique flavor. It has been useful to shine lights on dark places in myself that I need to bring and change lead into gold. And I can respect that process of going into that. That's very different than what some other people think of this entity. So which Lucifer are you summoning? The Lightbringer or Satan, the great adversary, who does all the bad things in the world because people don't want to admit that maybe they do the bad things in the world. So this goes back to a lot of the things we talked about in the show. It's a good way to think about it too. How you define many of these entities is how they show up. So how you define Jesus is how he'll show up. How you define Lucifer is what you'll get. It's not always that's all you'll get, but it's usually a starting point in the direction it'll go.
Now, there's a person named John Ramirez, and he talks a lot about Satanism and how he was one of Lucifer's children, where he was given powers to, where if he told Satan, hey, I want that person taken out, well, they were taken out. Have you heard of John Ramirez?
And why isn't he, if that happened, and that was all true, why isn't he a multimillionaire or billionaire? Anyone can change their beliefs. And in fact, you know, from Hands on Chaos Magic, my book, you know that I talk about that. You can change your beliefs. I would ask different questions, like what did he get out of it? Calling himself a Satanist at that point. What did he gain? And that you can actually ask a lot of questions about motivation, disinformation, all the things you're getting at. Because any information we can get, a teacher might be very good. I consider myself a very good teacher. My students would say I'm a very good teacher, but I have my own biases. I have my own flaws, my own ways of looking at things. But any information you get from a person, a book, or place, you need to have critical thinking. You really need to think about, where does this information come from? What is the author getting at? What's their perspective on reality? How does it actually interplay? At that point in time, when he was on your show, he quite possibly believed what he was saying. Well, what did he get out of it? What's his perspective on reality? How does it flow into things? Is this a philosophy that helps me? Is there information and assumptions he has, assumptions that I can believe? These are important questions. I know people don't think that you should have your rational mind fully intact when you get into a cult, but it's your most powerful weapon. It's what you should have up in front and center. Like, is this a person I even like? I mean, that's another question. Like, is the information they have good? Is it what they like? Good? Is it something that's worthwhile to me? Is somebody saying, hey, that's not to rip on the guy, but is someone saying, I'm the daughter or son of Lucifer? Well, in some religions, we're all the children of spirit. So what do you gain out of that? What do you gain from that philosophy?
Well,
What do you
let me
get out
jump
of it?
in
What do
here
you
real
personally
quick.
get out of it? Like, you, the listener, does it help you?
Right.
Is it rational?
Right. So
Does it fit your experience of the world? I don't read Aramaic, but I've talked to people who do. And there's lots of stuff that seem like in Aramaic it's codes. And that's a whole different topic, and I'm not an expert on it. But it's all coded symbols. What you would expect from a religion. one that you have to meditate on, understand the coded symbols, than not. And like I said, many people get very great results from Christianity. I don't want to bash Christianity at all. We can talk about Christianity as a political entity and as personal beliefs in Christians. I know lots of Christians. They live up to their values. They're wonderful people. I want to say that on the radio. I mean, they're totally wonderful people. They give things to their friends. They are honest, and they live by those principles. And that's very, 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 very enlightening and very cool to see. And there's a lot of people who don't. We have to acknowledge there's a big difference. Now, when we talk about works such as the Bible, we talk about these books, we have to realize every single one of them were touched by the hand of man. How much do we trust the people who wrote them?
A very special thank you to our guest tonight. For all of you that had the opportunity to be here with us, if you enjoyed the show, follow us on YouTube, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord, for the most recent interviews, videos, and podcasts. Or you can check us out on the World Wide Web, www.leakproject.com. Would you like to be a guest on our show? Do you have information that the world needs to see and hear? Send us an email, guestbookings@leakproject.com. Thank you, everybody. This is Rex Bear with Leak Project. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. Good night.